In the afternoon, the light settles differently in this part of London. It moves slowly across the back garden, thinning as it reaches the trees beyond the fence. The air carries sound from Richmond Park, wind through branches, the distant call of birds, the low movement of deer somewhere out of sight. The city is close, but it doesn't press in. It gives relief here. Inside the house, a man sits near a window with a notebook open on his lap. The pages are filled with small, careful handwriting, observations, recollections, sentences worked and reworked until they sit correctly. There is no rush in the way he writes. Time has loosened its grip. What matters now is accuracy and tone. He looks up often, not out of distraction, more of habit. A lifetime of watching has trained his attention outward. Once, his work required constant travel. I think we would all agree David Attenborough has seemingly travelled every inch of our planet. Jungles, oceans, deserts and glaciers, places defined by scale and danger and distance. Now, the natural world arrives more locally. A fox crossing the path at dusk, frost settling on the grass, the sound of rain moving across the city in stages. Nothing dramatic or rare, but funnily enough, it's just as much to look at. He has spent most of his life translating complexity into calm, helping others see what he sees without feeling overwhelmed, letting wonder arrive without demand. This instinct has now followed him home. Welcome back to Sleepy Archives, the podcast where we slow down and take our time walking through the lives of the renowned, the eccentric, and the loved. Tonight, we dive into the remarkable story of David Attenborough, environmentalist, animal activist, presenter, and perhaps above all else, educator. This story is one rooted in adventure, focused study, and love for our planet. Long before the voice became familiar, before it was trusted, and before it settled into living rooms across decades, there was a boy walking slowly through the Midlands, pockets full of things most people didn't notice. He collected stones, fossils, beetles, old bones pulled up from the soil after rain. He lined them up carefully on shelves, labelled them in neat handwriting, and treated each one as if it had arrived with a story already inside of it. Nothing was ever thrown away casually, and nothing was ever dismissed as ordinary. David Frederick Attenborough was born in the spring of 1926 in Isleworth, West London, though his childhood would take shape further north in Leicester. His father, Frederick Attenborough, was a scholar and later principal of University College Leicester. His mother, Mary, had trained as a writer and carried quiet attentiveness into the household. Books were present everywhere, and so was conversation. Curiosity was always encouraged, but never forced. The family home sat near the university grounds. Students passed through regularly, bringing with them accents, ideas, and a sense that the world extended far beyond the garden gate. David and his brothers grew up in a house where learning was part of the atmosphere rather than a lesson plan. Knowledge wasn't something you performed, it was something you lived alongside. From early on, David was drawn less to the people than to patterns. He noticed how ants moved in lines, and how birds returned to the same branches, how the shape of a leaf could suggest where it had grown and why. He spent hours outside, often alone, examining small things with a patience unusual for a child. There was no urgency in the way he looked, no sense of needing to arrive at an answer quickly. During the Second World War, the Attenborough household took in 2 Jewish refugee girls from Germany. They lived with the family for several years. The arrangement was practical, understated, and quietly formative. The presence of displacement, loss, and survival existed alongside everyday routines. It wasn't quite discussed at length, but it was understood. The world, even then, was fragile, and lives could be interrupted without warning. David attended Wigston Grammar School for Boys, where his interest in natural history deepened rather than softened with age. While others moved towards sport or social life, he remained absorbed by geology and biology. He developed a particular fascination with fossils, often cycling miles to examine rock formations or abandoned quarries. The earth, to him, was layered with memory. Time was something you could touch if you knew where to look. At 16, he won a scholarship to study natural sciences at Clare College, Cambridge. The war, however, interrupted that path. He was called up to the Royal Navy in 1944 and trained as a radar technician. For 2 years, his life became structured by machinery, by discipline and repetition. It was a different kind of observation: screens instead of soil, signals instead of birdsong. But the habit of watching carefully, of waiting for meaning to emerge, remained intact. When he returned to Cambridge after the war, he resumed his studies with a steadiness that would come to define him. He did not rush, he absorbed. Zoology and geology appealed to him greatly, not because they offered authority, but because they offered coherence. They explained how things fitted together. There was no sense, at this stage, that his life would be public. Broadcasting did not factor into his ambitions. He imagined himself working in museums, perhaps teaching or writing. The idea of speaking to millions would have felt distant, even inappropriate. He was far more comfortable listening. After graduating in 1947, he took a position editing children's science textbooks. The work was quiet, precise, and methodical. It suited him very much. He was learning how to explain without simplifying, how to guide attention rather than command it. It was around this time that he applied for a job at the BBC, not as a presenter, but as a producer. Television was still experimental, awkward, unpolished perhaps. Cameras were heavy. Broadcasts were limited. Nature programming barely existed at all. Animals, when they appeared on screen, were usually presented as curiosities rather than lives with context. David Attenborough entered this world without a blueprint. He did not arrive with a voice ready-made for narration or a persona shaped for screen. He arrived with the same thing he carried since childhood: a careful way of looking, and the patience to let the subject speak first. The rest would take time. When David Attenborough joined the BBC in the late 40s, television was not yet a finished product, rather a workshop. Broadcasts were infrequent. Equipment was heavy and unreliable. The medium had not yet learned its own grammar. There were no established rules for how to show the natural world either, or even whether it could be shown at all. Animals, when they appeared, were usually framed as novelties. The emphasis was on spectacle, not necessarily understanding. Attenborough entered quietly as a producer. He had no ambition to be on screen. His interest purely lay in shaping programs from behind the camera, deciding what mattered, how long to linger for, when to stay silent, and when valuable information was needed. At first, he worked across a range of subjects: talks, panels, discussions, educational segments. The BBC at that time encouraged flexibility. You learned by doing. You learned by failing in public. There was little separation between experimentation and the real thing. However, natural history kept pulling at him. It was not an obvious fit. Filming animals in the wild was technically difficult and financially risky. Much of what audiences knew about wildlife came from zoos or illustrated books. The idea of following animals in their own environments felt ambitious and perhaps unnecessary at the time. Attenborough disagreed, of course, though he rarely framed his disagreement as opposition. He simply began proposing ideas. The breakthrough came in the early 50s with Zoo Quest. The premise was deceptively simple. Travel to distant parts of the world, film animals in the wild, and bring some back to London Zoo as part of conservation and study efforts. It reflected the thinking of the time, before ethics around captivity had fully shifted. What mattered most was access to places and species, to ways of seeing that were otherwise unavailable. For Attenborough, though, the travel was not the point. Observation was. He appeared on screen out of necessity and clarity. Someone had to speak. Someone had to explain what was being seen. He did so plainly, without much performance. His voice had not yet acquired its later familiarity. It was lighter, quicker, and occasionally uncertain. He spoke as a guide rather than authority. Audiences responded well. There was something disarming about the way he moved through unfamiliar landscapes, attentive, respectful, and often visibly awed. He did not dominate the frame. He simply shared it. Animals were not props, but participants in the program. The camera lingered. The narration waited. As you can imagine, behind the scenes the work was demanding. Travel was uncomfortable and unpredictable, as well as filming conditions being difficult. There was risk involved. Physical, logistical, emotional risk. Attenborough absorbed these pressures without dramatising them. He treated the experience as an extension of learning, rather than adventure. Over time, Zoo Quest reshaped what television could do. It suggested that viewers were capable of patience, that they would follow complexity if it was offered concisely, and that wonder did not need embellishment. These ideas would become central to Attenborough's later work, though at the time they were simply practical choices. As his reputation grew, so did the responsibilities. He moved into senior roles within the BBC, eventually becoming controller of BBC Two in 1965. The move placed him further from the field and closer to institutional decision-making. He oversaw programming well beyond natural history, including landmark expansions into arts, education, and experimental television. Attenborough proved adept at leadership, though he felt it never fully suited his temperament. He believed in giving people room to think. He trusted expertise, and he resisted interference unless it was necessary. Under his guidance, BBC Two developed a reputation for intelligence and ambition, even when audiences were small. However, administrative work required abstraction, planning rather than witnessing, strategy rather than attention. For someone whose instincts had always leaned towards direct observation, the distance became difficult to ignore. He did his job carefully. He did it well, but the pull back to nature was strong, and one he couldn't ignore for long. He eventually stepped away from executive responsibility in late 1972, and although he'd overseen many milestones in broadcasting at the time, such as the first colour broadcast, his time in senior management had come to an end, and he returned to freelance nature presenting. He went back to the field older, more experienced, and clearer about what he wanted to do. The natural world was changing, habitats were shrinking, and species were disappearing fast. The work ahead would need more than curiosity. The voice that would later become inseparable from nature itself was still forming, but the foundation was already there, shaped by years of restraint, trust in the audience, and a belief that attention, given patiently, could change how people saw the world. By the mid-70s, David Attenborough was back where he felt most himself, outside institutional structure, closer to the field, and free to think in longer arcs. He was in his late 40s now, older than many presenters, and more experienced than most producers. Television had changed a lot too. Cameras were now lighter. Colour broadcasting was well established. Audiences were more accustomed to waiting, to listening, to staying with an idea rather than skipping past it. Natural history programming, however, still tended to fragment the story. Animals were grouped by habitat or behaviour, presented in isolated segments. What was missing was cohesion. Not just what animals did, but how they were connected and why they existed at all. Attenborough had been thinking about this for years. In 1976, he began work on a project that would attempt something television had not done yet: to tell the story of life on Earth as a continuous process, not a collection of episodes, but a narrative that stretched across geological time. Evolution, until then, largely confined to textbooks and lecture halls, would become the spine of a major television series. The scale was unprecedented. Filming took place across dozens of countries over several years. Rainforests, deserts, coastlines, and caves. The logistics were complex, the budgets were high, and the risks were real. There was no guarantee that audiences would follow such an abstract premise. Evolution is not immediately visible. It requires patience, explanation, and trust. Attenborough placed himself within the frame, but carefully. He did not stand apart from the subject. He moved through it. He knelt beside animals and entered their environment slowly, often at eye level. His presence was steady and unobtrusive. The emphasis was always on continuity between species, between past and present, between viewer and the world. When Life on Earth first aired in 1979 on the BBC, it reached an audience of more than 500 million people worldwide. The number mattered less than the response. Viewers did not feel lectured, they felt included. The language was precise but accessible, and concepts were introduced gradually, revisited gently, and allowed to settle. Across the series, that approach played out in quietly memorable ways. In one famous sequence, Attenborough sits among a group of mountain gorillas, lowering himself to their level, allowing them to move around him without interruption or attempt to dominate the moment. The scene unfolds slowly, framed by trust. Elsewhere, the camera follows the emergence of early vertebrates from water to land, the narration pausing long enough for the viewer to register what that transition means. A fragile experiment repeated over millennia. In another episode, he stands in a fossil-rich landscape, holding ancient remains in his hands, linking the texture of stone to living form without forcing comparison. These moments lingered long enough to be absorbed by audiences, taking up just enough space for knowledge to be consumed, but nature still the focus point. The series trusted its audience to think, to remember, to connect ideas across episodes. For many, it was their first sustained encounter with evolution as a living framework rather than a distant theory. It changed how people saw the Earth, no longer static, but adaptive, fragile, and interconnected. Attenborough was now in his early 50s, but his career felt newly aligned. The voice had deepened, the pace had slowed. His passive and considered style allowed an audience to feel the authentic care and passion he had for each animal he interacted with. The success of Life on Earth changed expectations within the BBC and beyond it. Natural history would no longer be niche programming. It could carry intellectual weight, visual beauty, and emotional depth without compromise. Follow-up series arrived at measured intervals, each building on the same philosophy. The Living Planet aired in 1984. The focus narrowed from origins to adaptation, and the examples became more intimate. In one episode, the camera stays with plants clinging to sheer rock faces, growing slowly in soil so thin it barely exists. The narration explaining survival not as triumph, but a bargaining between the elements and their inhabitants. In another, animals are shown enduring extreme cold, movement slowed, energy conserved, life pared back to essentials. There are long sequences in deserts where almost nothing happens at all. The absence of life fascinating millions. Even lush environments are treated carefully by Attenborough. The attention drawn to balance rather than abundance. Each scene reinforces the same idea, that life does not conquer environments so much as learn, patiently, how to remain within them. Attenborough was knighted for his services to broadcasting in 1985. The honour arrived quietly, during a period when his work was already widely embedded in public life. It did not alter his role or manner, of course. There was no change in how he spoke or in what he chose to show, but it was a great symbol of the importance of his already great contribution to television, to natural history and education. The Trials of Life aired in 1990, centering on behaviour and survival. Each series expanded the scope while refining approach. The camera waited longer and the narration intervened less. Silence became as important as explanation. Technological advances helped, but they did not lead the work. Attenborough remained wary of spectacle for its own sake. New tools were useful only if they revealed something meaningful. A behaviour unseen, a connection previously hidden. By the early 90s, David Attenborough had become a point of reference. His programs were used in schools, cited in scientific discussions, and shared across generations. His name suggested reliability. Viewers trusted that what they were being shown mattered and that it had been chosen with care. Yet, even as his profile grew, his manner remained unchanged. There was no change in his being or performance style. The work continued at the same pace it always had. Slowly, deliberately, and attentive to context. The world, meanwhile, was, as always, changing. Scientific consensus around biodiversity loss and climate change was strengthening. Evidence accumulated. Patterns became harder to ignore. Attenborough, understanding the importance of this, chose not to alter his tone. He continued to show life as it was, believing that understanding preceded urgency, preparing his audiences with knowledge and gaining trust before leading into the serious themes some of his later work would hold. What had once been presented as continuity now carried an undercurrent of vulnerability. The story of life on Earth was still unfolding, but not without consequence. By the mid-90s, Sir David Attenborough's relationship with the natural world on screen had matured. The ambition was no longer to explain life in its entirety. That groundwork had been laid already. What followed would be rabbit holes of niche and detailed journalism filled with nuance. Some may say the content required closer attention. Still, he continued to deliver this information with accessibility at the forefront. In 1995, The Private Life of Plants aired, shifting the focus to organisms most people barely noticed. Plants, until then, had largely been treated as backdrop, static, passive, necessary, but not particularly remarkable to the average Joe. The series reframed this disillusion entirely. Using time-lapse photography and long-term observation, plants were shown as responsive, competent, and above all, adaptive. They moved toward light, they communicated through chemical signals, and they competed and defended themselves. Processes that unfold over weeks or years were condensed just enough to be perceptible without losing their integrity. Attenborough adjusted accordingly. His narration furthered into less and less. He allowed the images to do the work, stepping in only when context was needed. The effect was subtle but transformative. Viewers were asked to reconsider what activity looked like and where drama could exist. Many found these series to be an invitation to slow down. That same philosophy carried into The Life of Birds in 1998. Birds often admired for colour or song, were approached through behaviour and intelligence, courtship, migration, problem solving. The emphasis was on effort rather than visual beauty. Sir Attenborough placed himself sparingly within these environments, perched on a cliff or standing quietly among nest sites, careful never to overshadow the subject. Flight, perhaps one of the most visually stimulating of animal behaviours, was treated not as such, and instead reframed with purpose at the forefront. Adaptation. Energy was accounted for, risk was acknowledged. Nothing was without work, and by the end of the decade, the pattern was clear. Each new series reduced the distance between the viewer and the subject. In 2001, the Blue Planet expanded that attention outward again, this time, though, into the oceans. Much of marine life remained unseen by the public, not because it was rare, but because it existed beyond easy reach. Advances in underwater filming made access possible, but Attenborough remained cautious about excess. The sea was presented as vast, complex, but always vulnerable. Predation was shown without emphasis, and beauty appeared without comment. The scale of the oceans did not obscure their fragility. What had changed by this point was context. Scientific understanding of environmental degradation had advanced significantly. Overfishing, coral bleaching, and pollution were all becoming visible to the naked eye. These were no longer emerging concerns, but established realities. The Blue Planet marked a turning point, not just in Attenborough's career, but in how audiences understood the oceans themselves. For many viewers, this was the first time the sea was presented as a coherent system rather than a collection of isolated spectacles. The depth, the scale, and the diversity of marine life were made visible with a clarity that had not previously been possible on television. Specific sequences lingered in public memory. The camera followed deep-sea creatures rising slowly from darkness, bodies shaped by pressure and absence of light rather than familiarity. Coral reefs were shown as densely populated, fragile cities alive with interaction, but finely balanced. In polar waters, vast shoals moved as single organisms, their coordination precise, and their vulnerability implicit. Predation was shown without emphasis, but consequence was never absent. The series reached large international audiences and won multiple awards, but its significance extended beyond numbers or recognition. The Blue Planet altered the cultural position of the oceans. What had once felt limitless began to register as finite. What had seemed remote became proximate. The sea was no longer a backdrop to human activity, but a living system capable of collapse. However, Sir Attenborough's approach remained unchanged. There were no raised voices or appeals. The work trusted that exposure itself would be sufficient. That once people had truly seen the ocean and its rhythms, its dependencies, and scale, they would understand what was at stake. In hindsight, the Blue Planet now reads as a threshold moment. It stands between two phases of Attenborough's work. the era of introduction and the era of reckoning. The warning is not yet explicit, but it is present, carried in what is shown and what is allowed to linger. The oceans, vast as they are not immune. The authority Sir David Attenborough carried now was cumulative, built over decades of consistency. In 2002, Attenborough published Life on Air, his long-awaited autobiography that traced his journey from early broadcasting through decades of natural history filmmaking. The book moved with the same calm clarity as his programs, written not to impress, but to remember. He reflected on expeditions, production challenges, institutional change, and the gradual evolution of television itself. The tone was warm and, as always, accessible, shaped by curiosity rather than self-assessment. It read less like a career retrospective and more like an extended conversation, attentive to detail, generous with memory, and quietly grateful for the work. Attenborough was now entering his mid-70s. The physical demands of filming were greater. Travel became more selective. He knew what he wanted to show and what he was willing to leave unsaid. Moving into the mid-2000s, the tools of natural history filmmaking had advanced far enough to change what could be seen. Lightweight, high-definition cameras, remote rigs and aerial photography, these things were no longer novelties. They offered access to places and behaviours previously unreachable. What mattered now was how that access would be used. In 2006, Planet Earth aired on the BBC, setting a new benchmark for global wildlife television. The series spanned 11 episodes and covered every major habitat on the planet, from deep oceans to high mountain ranges, polar ice to dense jungle. The ambition was vast, but the presentation remained measured. Viewers were shown snow leopards moving across near vertical rock faces, birds of paradise performing elaborate courtship rituals deep within forest canopies, predators hunting at night using infrared cameras that revealed movement without any intrusion. Each sequence widened the frame, not just geographically, but perceptually. The planet now felt larger, whilst also highlighting its intricacy. It made it feel alive. Attenborough's narration adapted without changing character. His voice remained steady, explanation careful. The language did not chase the images, it kept pace with them. The effect was grounding. Planet Earth reached unprecedented audiences worldwide and became one of the most successful natural history series ever broadcast. Its cultural impact, much like Blue Planet, was immediate and sustained. For many viewers, this was the first time the planet was seen as a single, interdependent system, visually. The clarity it provided made absence visible. Vast landscapes appeared intact but fragile. Ice fields stretched wide, but they were thin. Migration routes that were ancient were becoming increasingly interrupted. Nothing was framed as lost outright, but the conditions for loss were now impossible to miss. Attenborough did not underline this. He allowed the images to carry their own implications. That restraint continued with Frozen Planet in 2011, which returned attention to the polar regions. That restraint continued with Frozen Planet in 2011, which returned attention to the polar regions. environments that had already begun to shift dramatically. The Arctic and the Antarctic were presented as places of precision. Seasons were short there, margins were narrow, and survival depended on timing and balance. The series documented melting ice shelves, altered hunting patterns, and the changes in migration also seen in that of planet Earth. The conclusion highlighted the cold truth that this could no longer be attributed to natural variation alone. For the first time, the immediate effects of climate change were visible within the structure of the programs themselves, not as commentary yet, but still part of the narrative. Attenborough acknowledged this carefully. The tone, as always, remained calm. The explanations remained factual. What had changed was that the evidence now occupied the frame. By this point, Sir David Attenborough was in his mid-80s. The physical demands of filming were now significant, and his appearances in extreme environments were more selective. Yet his presence carried greater weight than ever. The trust he had built over decades allowed him to stand within these places without needing to persuade. Audiences naturally followed wherever he went. Planet Earth and Frozen Planet did not quite abandon wonder. They deepened it, but the wonder was now paired with awareness. Beauty existed alongside precarity. The Earth's complexity no longer felt endless. The work had reached a stage where attention alone was no longer neutral. What viewers did with that attention, how they carried it forward, would soon become part of the story itself. By the 2010s, David Attenborough was working within a landscape that had changed visibly within the span of a single career. The question was no longer whether the natural world was under pressure. That had become evident across decades of filming. What remained was how to show that pressure without abandoning the approach that had built trust in the first place. In 2016, Planet Earth 2 aired, returning to the global scale that had defined the original series a decade earlier. Technological advancements allowed cameras to move closer and follow longer. Drones traced animal movement across terrain that had once been unreachable. Ultra-high definition images revealed texture and behaviour with unprecedented clarity. Animals were no longer framed only within untouched wilderness. Cities, roads, and human structures entered the frame more frequently. Lizards outran snakes through urban streets, and birds adapted to artificial light. Predators adjusted their hunting patterns around human presence. Sir David Attenborough's narration remained steady. He did not pause to explain what these scenes represented. He described what was happening, precisely, and without embellishment. The implication was left intact. The series was widely watched and widely discussed. Its reach extended beyond traditional natural history audiences. Clips circulated independently, detached from context, carrying images of adaptation into everyday conversation. The separation between human and animal worlds felt thinner. The following year, in 2017, Blue Planet 2 brought the environmental impacts of climate change into sharper focus. For the first time, the effect of human activity on marine environments occupied consistent space within the arc of the series. Plastic pollution appeared not as an abstract issue, but an extension of the landscape now. Nets drifted through open water and debris settled into seabeds. Animals encountered human waste as part of their surroundings. The response was overwhelmingly immediate. Public attention was caught. Conversations moved from admiration to accountability. Policy discussions followed. Behaviour changes in small but measurable ways. Attenborough did not reposition himself within this moment. His tone remained even as it always had. His language stayed descriptive, and the authority he carried allowed the evidence to stand without reinforcement. Also that year, Sir David Attenborough published an additional autobiographical body of work, Adventures of a Young Naturalist, returning again to his earliest years in broadcasting and field work. The book revisited expeditions, early mistakes, and moments of discovery with affection. There was nostalgia here, but it was never indulgent. The writing remained grounded in observation. The feel of places, the strangeness of encounters, and the quiet confidence of a young man still learning how to look. Read alongside his later work, the book offered continuity rather than contrast. It carried the same curiosity and steadiness, simply carried across time. In 2018, he fronted Dynasties, narrowing the focus once again, this time to individual animal families, followed over extended periods. The scale contracted, time stretched, viewers stayed with a single lineage long enough to understand vulnerability as more than a concept. This choice was deliberate, of course. Rather than widening the frame further, Attenborough allowed attachment to form. Loss, when it occurred, was not isolated. The consequences of environmental pressure continued to be felt through each journey and each arc. By this point, Sir Attenborough was in his early 90s. His on-screen appearances were more measured, and his physical presence was quieter. Outside of the series themselves, his public role had expanded. He spoke at international forums and addressed political leaders. He participated in conversations that extended beyond broadcasting and focused on the environmental impacts he had been narrating and documenting over the span of his 50-year career. As his presence began to extend more visibly into public and political spaces, he began addressing world leaders at the UN, speaking about biodiversity loss and climate instability in language shaped by observation rather than instruction. In 2018, he spoke at the Conference of Peace 2024 in Katowice, Poland, addressing delegates with the same measured clarity he brought to his programs. The emphasis remained on evidence, on timelines, on what had been seen, documented, and repeated, often enough to establish pattern. These appearances were not framed as interventions. He spoke slowly, allowing space for the weight of what was being described. At home, his life had narrowed further into routine. He continued to live in Richmond, close to the park he had walked for years. His days followed a quiet structure: reading, writing longhand, listening to the radio, preparing scripts with care. He worked closely with long-standing collaborators, shaping language precisely, adjusting emphasis, removing anything that felt excessive. Even now, nothing was rushed. He had been married to Jane Ebsworth for nearly 50 years until her death in 1997. The loss remained private, like much of Sir David Attenborough's personal life. He spoke of her rarely, but when he did, it was with gratitude. Their 2 children were now grown. His family life existed alongside his work, and not within it. Age altered the logistics of filming, but not the discipline behind it. Locations were always chosen carefully. Time in the field was managed around physical limits. His presence, when it appeared, now felt much more deliberate than habitual. Viewers noticed the economy of movement and the way he conserved energy without withdrawing attention. The work continued. The evidence accumulated. The distance between observation and responsibility grew shorter, held together by the same careful attention that had defined his life from the beginning. By the end of the 2010s, Sir David Attenborough carried with him a record of change happening to our planet. The accumulation of decades of return journeys, repeated locations, familiar species encountered under altered conditions had produced something quieter than urgency, but heavier. The evidence no longer arrived as isolated moments. In 2020, Sir David Attenborough, A Life on Our Planet, was released. The film differed in tone and structure from his other work. It was not organised around habitats or species. Instead, it unfolded as a statement of presence. Attenborough spoke not only as narrator but as witness. The framing was simple. He placed his own life alongside the accelerating changes he had observed: population growth, industrial expansion, and loss of habitat. The footage drew from decades of archival material, and it wasn't to celebrate longevity. Places revisited across time revealed what no single expedition could show. His language and delivery remained calm, but what distinguished the film apart from others was its ethical position. Sir Attenborough spoke plainly about what had been lost, what was under threat, and what remained possible. The emphasis was not on consequence. Rather than removing himself from the narrative, he acknowledged his presence within it. A human life running parallel to ecological change. The choice did not feel confessional, but logistic. This was the most accurate way to tell the story now. The response to the film again was immediate and wide-reaching, and circulated beyond traditional natural history audiences, entering classrooms, policy discussions, and personal reflection. Viewers encountered it less as entertainment than as documentation. The tone also invited attention. In the years surrounding its release, Sir Attenborough's public role continued to expand, though his manner did not. He continued to address the United Nations on multiple occasions, including the UN Climate Change Conference in 2021, speaking directly to delegates about climate responsibility. His words were unembellished, and he described observed outcomes rather than predicted futures. The authority he carried rested on time spent watching rather than time spent persuading. What distinguished these appearances from others was their stillness. In rooms often shaped by performance, he spoke slowly, and he allowed silence to sit between sentences. He treated complexity with patience, and his effect was disarming. Listeners leaned in. Away from public platforms, his days continued to narrow into routine. The scale of travel reduced further. Writing became more central. Scripts were refined carefully, often by subtraction. Each word was presented with purpose, and the discipline remained intact. He continued to walk near his home in Richmond when possible, observing seasonal shifts that now arrived earlier, lasted longer, or failed to arrive at all. What emerged across this period was a recalibration of purpose. His work no longer needed to introduce the natural world. That familiarity had been established. What mattered now was memory, holding together what had been seen long enough for it to matter. He did not frame this as legacy, nor did he speak in terms of endings. The emphasis stayed on responsibility as process rather than outcome, and the future remained open. The work continued in collaboration with others, shaped by shared effort. New filmmakers took on greater presence, new voices entered the field, and Attenborough's role moved towards mentor, sponsor, and guide. Now in his late 90s, Sir David Attenborough's public presence has become increasingly selective. The work has not stopped, but certainly slowed in visible ways. Appearances are now fewer, and travel is carefully managed. His voice, now carrying the weight of long familiarity for millions across the globe, continues his involvement in projects, despite his already vast body of work. In 2022, he collaborated on Green Planet, returning once more to plants, not as backgrounds, but as agents shaping climate, landscape, and tackling survival. The series felt like a new direction, essential to understanding the mysterious and unfurling rhythm of our planet. Growth, decay, and adaptation were shown as processes that unfolded regardless of human attention, yet were increasingly affected by it. Green Planet asked viewers to reconsider where agency lives. One sequence follows plants in the rainforest canopy competing for light, leaves angling and reshaping themselves slowly over time. Growth directed by necessity rather than intention. Movement is present, but it unfolds at a pace that requires patience. Elsewhere, the series lingers on desert plants, surviving through long periods of dormancy, waiting years for rain before responding almost immediately when conditions allow. The emphasis is not on endurance as heroism, but on timing. Life conserved and then released. In another episode, coastal mangroves are shown stabilizing shorelines, their tangled roots holding sediment in place, shaping ecosystems quietly beneath the waterline. Fish shelter there, young species develop there, reliant on these seemingly insignificant crevices. Protection offered through structure. Plants are not framed as metaphors or symbols, but as participants in climate systems, cooling environments, storing carbon, regulating water. The documentary's effect is cumulative rather than dramatic, and the planet's green systems are retold as corporate-like infrastructures, intricate and seemingly impenetrable. Life continues, supported by process that rarely announces itself. In 2023, Attenborough returned to the landscapes of his own country with Wild Isles. The series shifted focus away from the global scale that had defined much of his later work and towards the ecosystems of Britain and Ireland, coastlines, woodlands, rivers and peatlands, places shaped as much by human presence as by geology or climate. The tone was intimate. Familiar species were given the same attention once reserved for distant habitats. Seabirds nesting on exposed cliffs, ancient woodlands supporting fragile chains of life, and rivers altered by centuries of use, still capable of recovery when space was allowed. The series resisted nostalgia. These were not untouched environments. They were living systems under pressure, shaped by proximity. What Wild Isles offered was a recalibration of distance. The natural world no longer existed somewhere else, but it was present within daily life and accessible without travel, shaped by choices close to home. In 2025, Sir Attenborough kept things close to home himself with Attenborough's London, a wild city. The programme turned its attention to the capital itself, examining how wildlife persists and adapts within one of Europe's most densely populated cities. Foxes moving through residential streets at night, peregrine falcons nesting on high-rise ledges, insects and birds finding corridors of survival along canals, railway lines, and overlooked green spaces. The approach was observational, as always, rather than corrective. London was not framed as a problem to be solved, nor as an exception. It was shown as an ecosystem, shaped by movement, noise, and human proximity, one that continues to function in quiet and improvised ways. Public response to the programme reflected that closeness. Many viewers recognised their own streets, parks, and daily routes on screen. On social media, London residents responded with a warm pride rather than surprise, sharing sightings, memories, and a renewed attentiveness to the spaces they moved through day to day. The series did not introduce something new so much as give language and visibility to what had already been there. For Attenborough, the project carried a quiet symmetry. The natural world he had spent decades guiding audiences toward was now shown at walking distance, woven into ordinary life. Sir David Attenborough continues to speak in recorded addresses. He still writes forewords and continues to lend his venerated voice to projects that favour restoration over preservation. He makes it known ecosystems can recover when given time, space, and respect. His home has remained quiet. Days follow a familiar rhythm: reading, writing, listening, watching the park shift through seasons, changes no longer being flagged as anomalies, but as new patterns settling in. Those close to him describe a continued attentiveness to language, accuracy, and to tone. Scripts are still refined line by line. Public response during these years has been marked by gratitude. Attenborough rarely engages in public reflection on his own contributions to natural history, science, and the environment, but rather prefers to focus on the next challenge we face as a species and the restoration of this earth. In present day, much of what he has spent a lifetime showing the world is now widely known. The natural world no longer needs foundational introduction or as in-depth an explanation as it once did. Its complexity has been demonstrated repeatedly and its vulnerability documented carefully over time. What remains is the need for advocacy and awareness. Sir Attenborough, fully aware of this notion, will continue to do both of these until the day he is no longer able. The unfamiliar voice that once explained unfamiliar landscapes has now become a homecoming for all those in our modern world. Sir David Attenborough's work will remain an open project, ready to be continued by all of us here on planet Earth.